as being associated with particular racial groups. And if you look historically, you're at the different stereotypes or racist portrayals that have been out there. Really, we're talking about people who had really difficult lives in many cases, right? And so, the idea of Mexicans in the Western United States, again, meaning the kind of pejorative term, not nationality. Who are those people? A lot of those people were migrant farm laborers who had really difficult lives and were basically using cannabis to treat various conditions of their life, of pain and whatnot. If you look historically at kind of portrayals of Africans, a lot of the people were slave laborers or hard laborers that they were using cannabis because it helped them deal with PTSD, it helped them deal with chronic pain, it helped them deal with all of these kind of traumas that existed. And by focusing on race, we're missing that. We're missing that important history that really should justify interest in looking at cannabis now as a way of treating, again, PTSD or chronic pain and things like that. That pro-marijuana folks pro-medical marijuana folks are aware of, but a lot of people aren't, and they just kind of see those uses as being an excuse to smoke marijuana now, but really have these strong historical precedents saying that we need to look at this relationship and try to understand why it is that people have used this substance in consistent ways for a long time.
That's something really interesting that you mentioned, because the human body is really pretty amazing when it comes to gravitating toward things that help us
yeah.
or that our bodies need. And historically, I think that the use of cannabis was one of those things, that if somebody feels that they need it, even if they don't know why, they'll gravitate toward it. And I think you're right. A lot of people self-medicate without realizing that that's what they're doing, but they feel better when they were using it. Like before all of this information came out, that it would help with PTSD or that it would help with muscle pain or just general anxiety and sleeplessness and things like that. People who were using cannabis on a regular basis were, what I found in talking to like long-term users who used it long before any policy changes were made, they'll say, that they just felt better when they were using cannabis and they couldn't explain it, and now they can.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
And that's cannabis is just a plant, as the saying is, right? But it's important to understand how that fit in historically. And it was something that it can grow just about anywhere. And for people who harvest inflorescences for smoking, it can grow as a weed, and the plant prioritizes floral development. And so you can, it's something that is a subsistence pharmaceutical, or historically was a subsistence pharmaceutical for people that really didn't have many other options, or at least couldn't afford them or weren't allotted them. So, it's something that historically was important in very specific segments of human history in that role as being a subsistence pharmaceutical for people who didn't have a lot of other options.
So when it came to writing the book, how long did it take you? When did you start it?
Yeah, so I started really on cannabis in 2011. And before that, I'd studied various other plants. But as I studied the African history of it, I found that I really needed to understand, the global nature of the plant, And so I started reading, world histories of cannabis, and I just found that I distrusted pretty much everything I read. There's a lot of books that circulate widely in pro-cannabis circles. There's a lot of books. There's a couple books that circulate in anti-cannabis circles, and they both were saying kind of the same things that weren't convincing. There was a lot of evidence that they're not very well researched. The sort of things that I, as a college professor, say you need to cite your sources and you need to, do those sort of things. Most of the really widely spread cannabis histories just don't do that, or don't do that very well. And so I kind of put the Africa focus on hold for a couple of years so I could research a world history. And that's the first book that I published in 2014 was a world history. Once I was done with that, I returned to looking at cannabis in particular. And, it's a book that took a lot of time because, there's really very little that has been written very much on cannabis in Africa or the African diaspora more broadly. And so I had to learn about a lot of different places where I don't have direct experience. And what I ended up doing is kind of focusing on Central Africa, Western Central Africa, so countries nowadays from Angola to Gabon, really. And that's where the people-plant relationship we talk about as marijuana, that's where it originated, right? And so the word marijuana traces to Central African languages. It's Mariamba in a language called Kimbundu in northern Angola. And so I really looked just at that area or focused on that area and looked at the rest of Africa as kind of a broader context for that. And so I kind of traced the people that were coming out of that part of Western Africa, who were taken from that part of Western Africa, and looked at where they went across the Atlantic and how their knowledge survived across the Atlantic.
So you're still a practicing professor, correct?
Yeah. We finished finals last week. So
from the academic world, did you get any pushback when you were studying this? I mean, did anybody reject the idea that you were going to go into this? And are you teaching this particular subject now?
Yeah. No, I didn't have pushback against initiating the study. People thought it was interesting. What I've found, though, is a couple things. Other academics tend to be either like, hey, that's great, that's interesting stuff, it needs to be researched, or they're like, oh, you're studying cannabis because you're a stoner, right? And not really realizing that cannabis has some really interesting and important roles in human history that we don't understand very well. And the reason we don't understand it in a large sense is because prohibition really stunted research on the plant, on people-plant relationships in particular. And so I was never discouraged from doing the research, but it's not always been, well received simply because people don't a lot of times take it seriously. I do teach this, the material. The last week we finished a class on looking at drugs in society and in ecology. And I really benefited from talking with students about their interactions with and their experiences with and their knowledge of cannabis, because any one of us has a very limited window into what human experiences with cannabis are. But by talking to others, we can get a broader experience. And, the people who've had, probably the students who've had probably most impact on me are those that have had real troubles with cannabis in various ways, and saying, hey, for them to say, hey, there's a lot of potential in this plant, but there's also things that we should be wary of as well. That's important. And I try to make sure to be aware and respectful of that viewpoint just as much as the people who find, cannabis to be a wonderfully effective medicine for whatever they're taking it for. So getting that broad range of inputs has been very valuable for me.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I find it fascinating when I speak with medical professionals who have tried to bring up cannabis and study of the endocannabinoid system. And still to this day, despite all of the amazing medical advances regarding cannabis, it's so underrepresented in medical schools. And I'm of the belief that cannabis could actually transform the field of medicine. I mean, when you consider that 47,000 people died from opiates that didn't need to, because of, the misinformation that was out there about the overprescribing of opiates back in the 90s and early 2000s. And yet there's been this enormous resistance in the academic world to studying cannabis as a medicine. And obviously they weren't really allowed to because they're sanctioned by the U.S. government on a federal level, many of them, and they don't want to cross that line. So, and also we've had these issues with only one source of research cannabis, which is so poorly grown and filled with mold and all sorts of other pathogens that you can make patients sick by studying it.
It is really remarkable to kind of understand how the U.S. government has managed cannabis. I mean, it's even as a completely illegal industry, which it isn't at this point, but it's a huge industry, and it's treated as if it's valueless. And it's remarkable how little investment that the U.S. government has put into it. State governments are starting to invest in it a little bit, but there's still a lot to know. But my response would be that the medical literature on cannabis is so much better than the social sciences literature on cannabis. Like historically, what role did it have in different places? How did people use it? Why did they use it at different points in time, whether it's currently or historically? We know so very little about that. And the medical literature, there's a lot that can be added to it, but we know a lot about what it can do and what it can't do and those sort of things. So yes, I agree, but the social sciences, the histories component of studying cannabis, in my perspective, is even less well developed than the medical literature.
So I'm just curious, how would you propose people would address the topic of cannabis as a means of ending racism in America? I mean, that's sort of an obtuse question, and I apologize for that, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about it, because it seems as though cannabis has been so wrapped up in the racism in our criminal justice system, so there's got to be an antidote to it. And would it be studying the social aspects of cannabis to remove that stigma or to remove that racist bias that often comes with the regulation of cannabis?
Yeah, so I mean that's again a really complex question. So decriminalization, legalization, right? They're two slightly different things, but one of the biggest and most important arguments to make for decriminalization, for legalization, is because of the racism that exists in drug law enforcement, right? There's a lot of data out there that shows that, in this country and in Brazil, and there's a little bit in Europe as well, Portugal and Great Britain come to mind, that the people who suffer the most from drug law enforcement are people of color, right? And that shouldn't happen. So decriminalization means that there's less or lower risk there, but it's also really important to recognize that in places that have already decriminalized or legalized cannabis, racial bias still persists in drug law enforcement, right? We have that evidence from Chicago and New York City and in Colorado as well. And so the bigger problem is there's some fundamental social problems, in terms of structural racism and structural violence that need to be addressed. Drug control laws are part of the structure, but, just like thinking about and worrying about, racism and drug law enforcement historically in the United States, I mean, racism and law enforcement have been hand in hand since well before there was drug control laws in the United States. And so a big part of it to me is, what I feel like I can do is to look at the race and the stereotypes that exist within the cannabis literature and target those and say, look, this is a racist stereotype and we need to get past this and we need to get over this and we need to think more honestly and accurately about the plant and its uses. And so, for me, an important aspect of this is that a lot of the literature that I deal with in terms of slavery and cannabis use is really easily available, really super easily available. Some of the most important sources were in pharmaceutical journals in Britain, published in the 1860s, 1870s. And I know that most people don't go and read those things, but physicians at that point in time did. And physicians nowadays who claim to portray and represent the history of cannabis as medicine, they've made absolutely no mention of African diaspora, the experience of people in the continent or in the diaspora, nothing. And instead, what you see in the medical literature are these little historical anecdotes that Queen Victoria used cannabis or George Washington used cannabis. And those anecdotes are demonstrably and patently false. And there's no recognition of that, right? There's no recognition that a lot of the stories and the histories that we have of cannabis are politically motivated, right? And it's easy to see that in the